How's it going, Buckeye Nation? It's time for the Silver Bullets podcast. I am Michael Citro.
And I'm Chip Minnich.
And Chip, congratulations on a Big Ten championship.
Well deserved by Ohio State. Everything that they went through this entire season from start to finish, a Big Ten championship was a perfect way to end the 2018 regular season.
Absolutely. This is a team that we knew pretty much all season was flawed, but very, very talented. And, you know, I think we kind of got the game we expected from Northwestern on Saturday night in a game that Ohio State was basically comfortably leading at halftime. Northwestern kind of, had a last dying gasp sort of Freddy Krueger-esque attack in the third quarter, and then Ohio State took control again and said that's enough of that. And came away with a 45-24 victory in the Big Ten Championship in Indianapolis at Lucas Oil Stadium. And that, of course, is a larger margin of victory than Notre Dame had against Northwestern. So, which counts for absolutely nothing, apparently. But it does count for a Big Ten championship and eventually a trip to Pasadena to play Washington in the Rose Bowl in a game that, I mean, you and I will get excited about this. A lot of people who are a lot more spoiled than we are, or maybe a lot younger than we are, with maybe a little bit more of a feeling of entitlement, will take a 12-1 season. We take this 12-1 season with a 62 60-plus points hung on Michigan and a win in the Big Ten championship game and a trip to the Rose Bowl. And you and I are thinking, really good season. And some people are going, nope, not good enough.
Yeah, I think if you go back to the beginning of the season, if somebody had said that you were going to win against TCU in a neutral site game, you're going to win on the road at Penn State, you're going to win on the road at Michigan State, you're going to put 60-plus points on that team up north, knock them out of the playoffs, and win the Big Ten championship in Indianapolis, I think almost every Ohio State fan would have taken that without question. I think that when you say about kind of that feeling of entitlement and spoiled, is most people, after you rattle off all of those wins, would have anticipated that would have included a playoff trip. Mm-hmm. But it's a kind of thing where, as we will discuss later, the playoffs is always something that there's no clear-cut criteria as to what qualifies a team for the playoffs. Mm-hmm. And I'm getting an idea that even what disqualifies a team from the playoffs is still kind of very negotiable, to say the least.
Yeah, the criteria does exist. It's kind of open to a very broad interpretation, and it's bent, it's mangled sometimes. I think that part of what you and I would never have expected at the beginning of the season would be for three teams to go undefeated, and that certainly played into how it all shook out. But why don't we talk about Ohio State and the Northwestern Wildcats? You nailed the score, did you not?
I did, but I kind of, I appreciate, and I even kind of jokingly put up a Simpsons GIF to kind of celebrate that. But let's face it, I mean, that falls under the category of like a broken clock is twice.
Right, twice a day.
Is correct twice a day. Mm-hmm. So that was more of, I think it was more in line of what we had been talking about, how give credit to Northwestern, where we had anticipated the kind of game that Northwestern gave Ohio State. Granted, they didn't have the same kind of athletes, and Ohio State probably could have won that game much easier than they did. Mm-hmm. But it was testimonial to the scrappiness and the, as you said last week, I think aggravating manner that we thought Northwestern would pose, and they certainly proved that on Saturday night in Indianapolis.
Yeah, Northwestern's the way they play, it's just hard to blow the Wildcats out. They hang around, they slow the game down a bit, not quite like a service academy or anything, but they make it awfully difficult for you to just absolutely blow them out of the building. It's just hard to do it because They're very sound. They do a lot of. I mean, they have very smart coaching staff, and they seem to. I know on Saturday night it seemed like, oh, this would be a good time to do this play, and boom, Northwestern thought the same thing because they brought a run blitz and blew it up at the line of scrimmage or that kind of thing. They're really smart. You really have to break tendency against them. You really have to execute. I thought Ohio State did a pretty good job overall on the night. I wasn't real thrilled with some of the play calling. Their use of Bash, I think, lost yardage every single time. There was some obvious chemistry issues on the offensive line with Wyatt Davis being in there instead of Demetrius Knox. I thought that overall he played okay considering the big stage and it being a rare start, but I thought there were some growing pains there from Wyatt Davis that'll probably be cleaned up by the bowl game. When they let Dwayne Haskins do his thing, Dwayne Haskins did his thing, and that's not easy because Northwestern doesn't just line up and play man coverage with the one high safety and say, okay, beat us if you can. We're gonna shut you down. They mix up their coverages. They play a lot of zone. They keep everything in front of them. They make it very difficult for you to make big plays, and they make you make a lot of medium plays instead. Although Ohio State was able to make a couple of big plays, it really was a night of take 8 yards here, take 14 yards there, and kind of make your way down the field like that. There were not many opportunities to just go bombs away and get over the top on them.
And let's be honest, if I had told you that Ohio State is going to give up 4 sacks, and I would say the opponents are going to be against Michigan and against Northwestern, how many of you out there would have ever anticipated that Ohio State would not give up any sacks to Michigan, but would give up 4 to Northwestern on Saturday night, as we saw?
Yeah, I mean, Northwestern did a good job. They have a good front 7. I mean, that's really the strength of their defense. They have decent ends. They have tackles that can kind of occupy your blockers, which enables the linebackers to make plays. Patty Fisher is a very good player. I don't know if a lot of people have seen much of Northwestern this year, but I've watched several of their games, and he always flashes for me. What's his name? Gaziano is a good player.
Yes, defensive end.
Yeah, they have some good, talented players. They're not a Division II school. I mean, they have some legitimate talent on that defense, and they're well coached. And credit to them. They did a good job all night, and it was very difficult for Ohio State. And you knew it was going to be. I said it was going to be aggravating. I think I predicted 34-23. And it was looking pretty good for me until that last touchdown. But it was a kind of what we expected, and I know some of our fellow Ozone staff kind of had it a little more lopsided. I just never saw it that way. But I will say I'm surprised that Northwestern was able to come out and run for a 77-yard touchdown. Of course, it was aided by a slew of penalties that weren't called, but if they don't call them, they're not penalties.
Yeah, and one of the things, speaking of Northwestern, not only the toughness of their defense, I thought the class of Pat Fitzgerald came shining through the day after, I believe, after Ohio State won, and Pat Fitzgerald congratulated Ohio State on the win and said, we're looking forward to the rematch next October in Evanston. So keep that in mind, is that, I can't speak intelligently about how many players are going to be losing, but I believe Patty Fisher is a sophomore.
I think so
he'll
yeah.
definitely, he'll be in the lineup, and that game is starting to look like, okay, for a team that's going to be losing a lot of their core offensive players, when we think about the leading wide receivers, that when we've talked about this on previous podcasts, and you have the probability of Dwayne Haskins leaving, that game is looking more and more difficult as we look forward into 2019. But I think Northwestern, they certainly did everything that we thought that they would, and I thought that they represented the Big Ten West very well for most of Saturday night in Indianapolis.
Yeah, they really did. Patty Fisher, by the way, ended up with 11 tackles. Very good player. Like you said, he's a sophomore, young guy. Northwestern doesn't have a lot of guys who leave for the NFL early, so get used to him being around. So
Yeah.
yeah, Joe Gaziano had a pretty good game. I mean, they did what they do. I thought that they had a good, solid game plan, but in the end, Ohio State with the superior athletes just came to play. I was a bit surprised that Ohio State would have to throw for 500 yards in this game, but I thought they did a pretty good job, especially on Mike Weber. I thought that Dobbins looked like the more dangerous back on this particular night, but it seemed like Weber got an extra series here or there. It seemed to me, or maybe they just threw more when Dobbins was on the field after the first quarter. But it was an interesting game. It started off quite easily for Ohio State. They came right down the field. And Terry McLaurin catching a touchdown pass in front of a lot of friends and family in Indiana there. 16-yard pass from Haskins, and that was it was an interesting new wrinkle to Dwayne Haskins. He was forced out of the pocket a few times, and he kind of chose to leave the pocket a few other times. So I think Dwayne Haskins threw on the run more than maybe I've ever seen him all season.
Yeah, the evolution of Dwayne Haskins' game from even just a few weeks ago when we were lamenting his, I don't want to say his inability, but his I guess you would say his lack of desire to run the ball a few weeks ago, and now that's kind of come completely full circle. And like you said, the idea of on Saturday night, Dwayne Haskins being more out of the pocket than usual, but he had a tremendous game on Saturday night, which earned him his trip to New York City for this coming weekend for the Heisman Trophy presentation.
Absolutely. Phenomenal night for Haskins. I wish they would have called a few fewer running plays with him, but it is what it is. It seemed like at times maybe Urban was calling the plays, but anyway, Northwestern came back and tied the score on that 77-yard run. A missed tackle in the hole, a really bad angle from Brendan White. So I guess everybody that's played safety this year has taken a really bad angle at least once on a long run. And just an absolute undressing of Kendall Sheffield by, I don't remember if it was a tight end or a wide receiver, but he was getting both his jersey held and his face mask held and pulled. And he did get away eventually, but by that time John Moten was about 10 yards beyond him, and he was not able to run him down. And a lot of people talked about how slow he looked. I think one of the lines I saw was Kendall Sheffield is the slowest fast guy I've ever seen. But I mean, Moten had a head start, ahead of steam, and Kendall Sheffield was getting a bit fouled at the time. But it is what it is, and it was 7-7 at that point.
Yeah, it's kind of tough to make a tackle when your jersey's being held and your face mask is being held as well. So I'm going to cut him a little bit of slack there. But as you said, it was very poor angle taken by Brendan White, which led to what should not have occurred. I know we're going to talk about the final stats for Northwestern, but the vast majority of their running yards was on that one singular play that tied up the game.
Yeah, I believe Moten finished with 4 carries for 76 yards, and his first carry was for 77 yards. So, that was an anomaly, I guess you'd say. But it definitely gave everybody agita that was watching for Ohio State. Ohio State came back to go back ahead on a J.K. Dobbins 2-yard run to close out the first quarter scoring, and then it was all Ohio State in the second quarter. It was a Hobbiel field goal from 42 yards and a Terry McLaurin 42-yard pass from Dwayne Haskins as big night for the Indiana native. So that was nice to see.
Yeah, Terry McLaurin, we've been singing his praises more so for his contributions on special teams, and I'm certainly not trying to minimize the importance that he has had as a gunner, but I think it'd be fair to say that out of the wide receivers, he has certainly been kind of overlooked as when you think about as a threat. It's usually Paris Campbell, who I'm sure we'll talk about, and Johnny Dixon and KJ Hill and Oh, by the way, Terry McLaurin is up there too, and it just seems as though that a lot of people disregard the fact that Terry McLaurin has maybe not the same level of speed as Paris Campbell, but he's a dangerous deep threat as well.
Yeah, and it's nice to see him get rewarded because he's such a good blocker and he does so many of the little things well for this team, and he, certainly a special teams whiz. It's nice to see McLaurin get some glory, and especially in front of the home fans. So it was big. It was nice to see. And Ohio State takes a 24-7 lead to the locker room. Everybody's feeling pretty good, and you're feeling like it even could have been more if you think of the fact that that the big penalty on the long run wasn't called, and also not a single penalty, I believe, on Northwestern in the entire first half. Yeah, it was a little lopsided on the side of the flags.
And let's face it, I think after that first half, when Ohio State had, let's just say that they had this decided edge in terms of the points, and it seemed as though that they were in command. I think that's where most fans were thinking, okay, we just keep this up for another half, finish up the game, let's say 48-10 or 48-14, and we're in the playoffs. And maybe I'm not saying that the team did that, because I want to give credit to Northwestern for coming out and playing Ohio State really tough for the remainder of the game. But it certainly seemed as though at that point, if you were looking at it as an Ohio State fan, that the playoffs, the performance that Ohio State was putting on the field, at least for the first half, had Ohio State in prime playoff consideration, or at least that's what I think a lot of fans probably were believing.
Yeah, I was never there. Once Oklahoma won earlier in the day, I just figured it was over.
Oh, sure.
So I wasn't there at that point. I figured it would take something really substantial, and I just didn't see it happening against Northwestern. And, I said it last week. Pat Fitzgerald's team does not give up. So they came out of the locker room all fired up. This is our last chance. 30 minutes. We're not out of it. Let's see if we can climb back in this game and win a championship. Nobody believes in us. I'm sure he pounded that. Let's just go have fun, play football. No one gives us a chance here. And they played loose, and they came out and played hard, and they scored 14 points to pull within 24-21. There was a Clayton Thorson 18-yard run with a smorgasbord of holding that didn't get called, but hey, they weren't calling it all night. So Ohio State did not react to it. You have to get off blocks, and you also have to get off holds. And it's a lot harder to get off holds, but at some point sell it a little better, and maybe they'll start throwing the flag. But it didn't seem like they were capable of getting flagged at the point where they had about 14 or 15 guys on the field on defense, and it required a video review to see that.
Yeah, the penalties were certainly going against Ohio State for most of the night, and Northwestern, they came out as we anticipated with that never say die attitude, and they had all the momentum going into the final quarter. I mean, let's just face it, regardless of whether we're talking questionable calls that should have been called that weren't, or Ohio State just kind of taking their foot off the gas, or a combination of all of the above. Northwestern certainly was showing why the idea of a potential upset was not as far-fetched as a lot of people around the country may have believed.
Yeah, I think that there was some conservatism, too, on Ohio State's part. I think there were a couple of fourth and shorts that were near midfield that maybe on another night Urban goes for it, but he didn't on this night. And I think credit to Northwestern for that, because every now and then they would make a play where they got in your backfield and sort of put that doubt in your mind. It's like, well, maybe we don't risk that. So, kudos to them. Ohio State regained a little bit of composure right at the end of the third quarter with a 29-yard pass to Chris Olave, everybody's new favorite Buckeye, another weapon who, thank God he's a freshman, because it's going to be fun to watch this kid. Fourth quarter comes out, Northwestern is able to kick a field goal to pull back within 7, and then it was just Ohio State pulling away. A Johnny Dixon touchdown pass from Haskins and a J.K. Dobbins touchdown pass from Haskins, which was really phenomenal catch by J.K. Dobbins. I mean, that was a wide receiver catch made by a running back.
Yeah, J.K. Dobbins, I guess you could say his versatility as not only a runner, but as a receiver, I think has definitely been shown, thankfully, because of the emergence of Dwayne Haskins at quarterback, using the running backs as outlet receivers. But as you said, going back to some of the other players, especially Chris Olave, it is relieving to know that for a position group that is going to be so hard hit by, let's just say, eligibility, with Paris Campbell, John Dixon, Terry McLaurin having exhausted their eligibility, as well as the probable departure. It's not for certain, but most people believe that KJ Hill is going to leave.
Mm-hmm.
It is comforting to know that after losing your top 4 wide receivers, that a player like Chris Olave is waiting in the wings to take that next step up going into the 2019 season.
Can I just tell you that I saw some high school video of Garrett Wilson over the weekend and made me think he may be better than Chris Olave?
I've heard that. I'm not disputing the recruiting rankings, and I'm not trying to throw cold water on the idea about getting excited about incoming freshmen. It's just my nature to be very conservative and cautious when it comes to any freshman.
Sure.
And I'm going back 20 years. I remember watching Andy Katzenmoyer play in high school and thinking this guy is just going to wreak havoc when he gets to Ohio State. And sure enough, he did. But always in the back of my mind, even watching a player like Andy Katzenmoyer, thinking, okay, it might be a little different when you step on campus. But yeah, I think it's great to be excited about Garrett Wilson. I'm thinking when it comes to not only Garrett Wilson, but also, as we just talked about, Chris Olave. Let's hope that Ben Victor becomes a little bit more consistent, because the talent's there. Let's presume that Austin Mack is going to come back, because coming off of an injury, when I'm not suggesting that he can't play at the next level, I'm just saying his draft stock would not be too high.
Mm-hmm.
And then let's hope that Jalen Harris emerges. Now I'm feeling a heck of a lot better about that wide receiver group than I was a few minutes ago, lamenting the players that have lost. If these players all emerge as we anticipate them doing in 2019.
And if Dwayne does go pro, you're talking about, Tate Martell is a good quarterback. He's shown some flashes. Of course, he had that 10 for 10 game earlier this season. But Dwayne Haskins throws people open in a way that Tate Martell does not.
Yes, and so let's be prepared for another shift offensively with, I guess you would say, in terms of, not that they won't throw the ball downfield, but not nearly to the extent that Dwayne Haskins is capable of doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's going to be an interesting hybrid, I think, next year, because Tate Martell's a good runner, but he's not JT Barrett in terms of it's 4th and 2. JT Barrett's going to get you 2.5. Tate Martell, you don't know that. So, but that's a conversation for another day, maybe perhaps in the off season. Ohio State wins 45-24. Dobbins was the leading rusher, 68 yards on 17 carries. That's only a 4-point average. He did have a few here and there that were like 7 yards, 9 yards. I think his longest was 11. Mike Weber's longest was 11. Weber had 51 yards on 17 carries, only a 3.0 average. So not a great rushing night for Ohio State. Good job by Northwestern to clog up the lanes, and also just a lot of negative yardage on some of those bash plays that really kind of killed Ohio State's average. They were losing 4 and 5 yards on some of those plays. So Dwayne Haskins, 34 of 41, did throw a pick. That was kind of an ugly and uncharacteristic pick. Looked like maybe he thought the receiver was going to run a different route than he did. 499 yards, which made me really want them to throw one more pass on the last drive. But alas, he didn't quite make the 500 mark. He did break his own school record, though, of that he set earlier this year when he broke Art Schleicher's record against Purdue. We don't want to talk about that. Now we have a record in a victory. And
yes,
5 touchdowns.
Exactly. Yes, and it would have been nice to get to that vaunted 500-yard area. I also was kind of surprised, to tell you the truth, that they didn't throw something. I don't care, a small kind of dump pass out to a back or the tight ends or something, just to get to that 500. But I think Urban Meyer, out of respect for Northwestern, just wanted to get out of there with the win and didn't want to do anything that could, breathe new life into Northwestern, because it was a scrappy, hard fought game all the way throughout. Like you said, Ohio State pulled away kind of the way that you and I both anticipated, but let's face it. I mean, Northwestern, they came to play, and as you said, and I agree with you that there was no quit in the Wildcats whatsoever.
Yeah, I think if it had been Wisconsin or Michigan, we're seeing another pass thrown. But I think that Urban has a lot of respect for Pat Fitzgerald, and he wouldn't do that to Pat just to get Haskins over 500 yards. That would 499 is close enough to make the eye-popping numbers that that the Heisman voters who respected the game enough to not send their votes in early, to impress them. So, Johnny Dixon, big night, 7 catches, 129 yards. His longest was 63. Another bomb. This time the bomb didn't reach the end zone, but it was still a thing of beauty. Paris Campbell had 7 catches for 89 yards. It seemed like most of it was on the first drive, and he took a knock on a punt play actually, and I was surprised that Paris Campbell was in on a punt, considering he's not the punt returner. But then I thought, well, fast guys off the edge. Maybe he was in on the punt block attempt, but he got shaken up, and it was a while before he came back on the field. But most of his damage was early, and he started the night with a really, really nice catch in the middle of the field that Haskins had to fit a ball into, between some defenders in the zone. And it's a testament to how far Paris Campbell's come, because last year, maybe even certainly the year before, he's not making that catch.
Right. He's going to be missed next year. Let's face it. I mean, that kind of rare explosive speed and acceleration isn't something that you can coach. I mean, you either have that or you don't, and Paris Campbell has that. And getting back to what you talked about with Johnny Dixon, I'm really happy for him, just based on the ups and downs that he had throughout most of his career with regards to injuries. He was always battling hamstring issues, and at one point it seemed for certain that he was going to hang him up. So he's had a really good year, and it was great to see him have a really strong night in Indianapolis against Northwestern.
Yeah, very quiet night for KJ Hill, only 1 catch for 8 yards, which was the exact same stat line of DeMario McCall, who played a lot fewer snaps. McLaurin had only 3 catches, but 78 yards, 2 touchdowns. J.K. Dobbins had 50 yards receiving, and Olave had 79 yards and a touchdown. So a nice night for Zone 6 all around. Rashad Berry had a catch. Nothing for Luke Farrell, though. So definitely noticed some plays missing from the playbook in this one. It seemed like they had come into the game with some ideas of things they were going to do differently, and I'm not sure any of the new stuff worked, but it's nice to know that they could go back to the old stuff, and that worked.
And Northwestern, as you said, they weren't going to let Ohio State hurt them deep. So that might have been, maybe they were trying some of the new stuff thinking, oh, this will be for positive yardage, but it's a credit to Northwestern defensively being able to, as you said, shut some of the new stuff down and make Ohio State fight for all the points that they did put on the scoreboard.
Yeah, and I think some of the bash plays and some of the other runs that didn't work were maybe a mixture of not only Northwestern playing well, but also a lack of chemistry on that line with Wyatt Davis in instead of Demetrius Knox. I mean, it's not been a great season for the offensive line this year, but they played really well against Michigan, and it really only takes one change in the line to mess up chemistry sometimes, and it definitely looked like Wyatt Davis was not on the same page at times with the guys next to him, Michael Jordan and Isaiah Prince. So, they'll get that cleaned up. He'll get more reps, and everything will should work itself out, because Wyatt Davis seems like a talented kid.
And we've been talking about the departures along the offensive line, and I agree with you that Wyatt Davis, I think there were some chemistry issues, which was to be expected, even though Wyatt Davis has played somewhat as in reserve duty throughout the season. in with regards to Demetrius Knox. Ohio State is also not only losing Demetrius Knox after 2018, but they are losing Isaiah Prince. Mm-hmm. They are losing Malcolm Pridgeon. So, as you stated, the idea of developing chemistry along the offensive line is going to be something that's going to be paramount throughout the spring, and hopefully will be completely resolved by the time the 2019 season begins. Because let's face it, it's the kind of thing where you don't want to go into a football season without having any kind of true cohesiveness along the offensive line.
Yeah, I'm starting to feel like Brandon Bowen medical redshirt. That's what I'm starting to feel like.
I can only hope for his sake that that's in the discussion, because I would hate for Brandon Bowen to come back and not be. I realize that he was given the opportunity to come back, but I would rather him be at full recovered 100% versus let's just get him out of here because his eligibility clock is ticking.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk a little bit about the defense. Malik Harrison had 10 tackles to lead everyone, 6 solos, but he didn't seem quite as active as he was against Michigan, but still a good night, I think, for Malik. Jordan Fuller had 9 tackles, 7 solos. He had the most solo tackles, and he had a tackle for loss and a fumble recovery. Kind of a middling day for a lot of people. Not eye-popping tackle numbers for Chase Young, but Chase Young, for me, was amazing. He only had 3 tackles, all solos. They were all sacks. They were all tackles for loss. He forced a fumble. But Chase Young was in on so many plays that he didn't show up in the stat sheet for, Chip. He was constantly a threat to Clayton Thorson, making Clayton Thorson get the ball out early a number of times. They don't have him down officially on the stat sheet on the Ohio State site for any quarterback hurries, but if you watch the game, he certainly made Clayton Thorson hurry.
Well, when you say that Chase Young did not have a lot of eye-popping stats, I can't speak well for Clayton Thorson because I think he can speak for himself, but I'm sure the term that it may not necessarily be eye-popping, but certainly back-breaking to Clayton Thorson, because on that sack that caused a fumble, watching that play, that was certainly something that I'm sure Clayton Thorson woke up and it was still feeling the effects of the next day.
Mm-hmm.
That was the kind of play by Chase Young, not to minimize his importance throughout the rest of the season, but that was the kind of play that I thought, missing a healthy Nick Bosa on the other side, that I thought Chase Young was capable of delivering all season. And fortunately for Ohio State, he delivered in the biggest game, meaning the Big Ten championship, coming up and harassing Clayton Thorson. And like you said, his stats in comparison in terms of total numbers didn't compare to like Malik Harrison or Jordan Fuller, but he certainly made his impact well known on passing downs to Northwestern.
Yeah, I mean, it's really curious that Chase Young really has had 2 standout games this year, the Penn State game and the Northwestern game. He was okay against Michigan, but really, you look at him and he's such a specimen. He's so fast, and you just thought you'd get more out of him even without Nick Bosa on the field. And at times he's really just disappeared from the game where you haven't even noticed him. But you definitely noticed him Saturday night. In addition to the 3 sacks, I mean, he of course, I'm not sure how Clayton Thorson must be made out of adamantium, because he was able to get up after that hit where he fumbled the ball. Young also grabbed Thorson's arm, which made him throw the ball and hit his center in the head, which was eventually intercepted by Damon Arnett. I mean, just a number of difference-making plays in the game. So if Chase Young only had 3 tackles, so what? He was making a difference on every passing down, as you said.
And I wonder going into next year, considering the fact that Nick Bosa played, I believe, when Nick Bosa was healthy, that he would be lined up opposite the opposing team's left tackle, because that's usually your premier pass protector. So you're putting your premier pass rusher in that spot defensively to try and, like, kind of what we were just talking about with that blindside pressure on right-handed quarterbacks.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering if, and because that's kind of where Chase Young came from on that one play that you and I are talking about. I'm wondering if that might be the goal going into next season is let's put Chase Young on the left tackle, to attack the quarterback blindside, which means that on the opposite end, that's where Jonathan Cooper and or Tyreek Smith or whoever will have an opportunity to emerge and play that other defensive end spot. But yeah, Chase Young certainly showed that. I agree with you that this is the second time this season, both times against at Penn State and against Northwestern, he came up big when Ohio State needed him.
Yeah, it's good to see. It's really good to see, and I think Chase Young is one of those guys who's just going to continue to get better. I think a lot of people just still forget how young and developing and how raw he is, but he's certainly got all the tools, and he'll get better. And I think these will be the norm rather than the exception moving forward. So it's good to see. Of course, just a final note on the game. I harped on this all night because I don't like to harp on this, but there's nothing you can do about pre-snap penalties. There's not a lot you can do when you can't really say much about an obvious pass interference. So those I'll never get upset about when they get called. But if you look at the overall penalty numbers, 9 for 90 yards for Ohio State, 3 for 15 yards for Northwestern, and it's just become ridiculous how officials figure, well, Ohio State, they we need to make this even. We need to even this up because otherwise it's just going to be ridiculous. And all I want to do is I just want them to call it the same way both ways. That's all I ask for. So if Chase Young's getting held, which he did many times, call the hold. And if you're going to throw a flag for holding on Ohio State, that's fine. Just call it the same both ways. That's all I'm asking for. And I certainly don't think that there is an official, Chip, on the field whose job it is every play to count the number of players that are on the field. If you can't even get that right, then there's something wrong with the officiating.
That was probably the most egregious oversight that fortunately was corrected. But that was the one that I remember thinking, how is it possible that you're not calling too many men on the field? And then fortunately that penalty was corrected or was rectified. But I agree with you. I think the penalties, it just seems too maddening on a week-by-week basis for Ohio State to consistently be hit with so many penalties that the other team is not.
I mean, the one on Kendall Sheffield, I mean, it's how many times do you see Ohio State get called for holding on like a running play where Dobbins or Weber basically go nowhere and there's a hold. And then here's a guy going 77 yards with a hold and a face mask by the same player that sprung him on the edge where it's very easy to see and there's no call. I mean, that's just I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I just think it's because I think it's always ineptitude is always the more likely answer. It's more likely that they're inept than they're corrupt. But it was annoying and it does get old. I pointed it out in Grumpy Old Buckeye. I pointed out the disparity because judgment calls are judgment calls, and there's something that sometimes you can't do anything about those. I'm not going to complain if you call pre-snap penalties because those are obvious. I'm not going to get mad if you call an obvious pass interference. That's something Ohio State needs to still work on. But the disparity in holding calls just continues to baffle me. And yeah, I'm sure Ohio State gets away with a game that they don't get called. But I mean, you can go back, Chip, throughout this season, and there are several games where Ohio State's opponents did not get a single holding call the entire game, and including this.
Well, I realize we're going to talk about the Rose Bowl as far as Ohio State's destination, maybe not even necessarily on this podcast, but I'm not entirely sure which conference is going to be officiating the Rose Bowl against Ohio State and Wisconsin and Washington. So maybe we'll get the benefit of a better officiating crew come January 1st.
Well, we know it will probably be either SEC, Big 12, ACC. One of those conferences will probably be officiating. I would guess.
Right.
All right, so we turn the page on Northwestern. Thank you for showing up, Wildcats. We appreciate you being there. Ohio State wins the Big Ten championship for the second straight year. It was, not as dominating as some folks would like, but if you look at really the end of the first half and the end of the game, Northwestern made noise the way we thought they would, but Ohio State handled them. It was a 3-touchdown win is about as comfortable as you should expect in a championship game for a conference.
And as I said earlier, Ohio State, they travel to Evanston next October, and I'm anticipating quite a battle.
Absolutely. It's going to be one of the more difficult games on the schedule, especially for all the reasons you mentioned in terms of all those guys that are leaving. So, and all the guys that are not leaving for Northwestern, they will be, I believe, though, having to play a new quarterback next year.
I believe it's going to be a transfer from Clemson. Maybe I think the player's name, I think it's Hunter Johnson, who was a highly coveted recruit who decided to leave Clemson due to the emergence of Trevor Lawrence. And he has been sitting out this year with the anticipation he's going to be the starter next year in Evanston. So remains to be seen. A lot can happen between now and next season, but at least Northwestern, they can feel somewhat comfortable knowing that they have a talented player on the horizon for them at the most crucial position.
Yeah, and I will say this was a very good recruiting season for Northwestern. This season, I think, showed a lot of people that, Northwestern is a great school, and I think that this was a good advertisement for their program.
I was really impressed with the fact that I'm not sure, I might get the numbers wrong, but I believe that there was an anonymous booster who bought tickets for 3,500 students to attend the game. And at first glance, you're probably thinking, all right, 3,500 people, okay, big deal. But Northwestern, their campus only has about 8,000 plus students. It's not a very big school for the Big Ten. So needless to say, out of an 8,000 something student body, for 3,500 students to be able to make the trip kind of spoke to the level of interest that the students had in supporting Northwestern in Indianapolis.
Yeah, that would be like the equivalent on the Ohio State side would be about 30,000 students having tickets bought for them.
Right.
So, all right. Let's turn our attention away from the game and toward Dwayne Haskins. Just a phenomenal run of games for Dwayne here at the end of the season. 400 plus yards over and over. Records falling every week. New Big Ten championship game record for completions, for yards, for touchdowns. Erasing Trace McSorley's name from the record books. And of course, he made the Heisman pose in the end zone. Dwayne Haskins, Chip. Realistically, where do you place him in the Heisman race? Obviously, Kyler Murray and Tua Tagovailoa, I can't ever pronounce his last name, from Alabama. We all know we miss Tua. Those are the guys who have been the favorites all year long. Dwayne Haskins, you hardly heard anybody say his name until recently. Certainly his name was kind of in the background earlier in the year, but where do you put him? Where do you think he opened enough eyes to actually have a legitimate shot? Everybody's saying this is going to be one of the closest Heisman races in years.
I would like to believe that his performance down the stretch certainly will give him a shot. I don't know, as you said, if a number of other individuals have already mailed in their ballots early, that might hurt Dwayne Haskins. He might be a fast closing third. And I mean that with no disrespect to Dwayne Haskins. I just think it sounded as though from the beginning of the season, it sounded like it was Tua Tagovailoa's trophy to lose
It
from
did.
the beginning. And then Tua kind of cooled off, and Kyler Murray started gaining more and more momentum. And it wasn't until the last few weeks that Dwayne Haskins, not that he played poorly, but that he kind of suddenly reemerged, if you will, because it used to be Dwayne Haskins and Tua at the beginning of the season, and then when Ohio State was kind of slumping, for lack of a better word, in the midseason in some of those games where Dwayne didn't have nearly the kind of games that he had at the beginning. That's when he kind of fell back. But his performance over the last few weeks on the biggest stages for Ohio State against Michigan, which was the number one ranked defense in the country at the time, the number four ranked team at the time, shredding them, helping to contribute 62 points on the board, and then the performance he just had against Northwestern. Certainly, you're talking a primetime game, national scale. The eyes of the country were watching Ohio State because Ohio State was still a factor in the playoff race. You would like to believe, as an Ohio State fan, that it certainly opened some eyes, and for those people who hadn't mailed in their ballots, made them kind of reevaluate Dwayne Haskins. But I'm of the opinion he's going to finish third, but I'm kind of wondering how much ground he may have gained. I'm thinking in terms of a prediction, I think it's going to be Kyler Murray, because Kyler Murray to win it simply based on the fact that Tua has struggled with injuries down the stretch.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe that Dwayne Haskins is closed strong down the stretch, but I think it's going to be Kyler Murray when it's all said and done on Saturday.
I kind of agree with you. I think it's going to be Murray. I think people have fallen so in love with Oklahoma's offense, and it would have been nice to have seen Dwayne Haskins go up against Big 12 defenses this year. But in many cases in nice weather instead of like on a windy night in West Lafayette, but or the cold up in East Lansing. But Dwayne Haskins, certainly, I think he'll finish third as well. I think he did close some ground. I don't think there'll be enough people split between Kyler and Tua for him to sneak up in there. But you never know. We'll see how it plays out. He finishes the season second in the country in yards per game, 352.3. Gardner Minshew of Washington State won that category, by the way. And if you look down the list, Kyler Murray is seventh in that category. And let's see, where did Tua end up? Tua is all the way down to 23rd, 257.9 yards per game. So, you look at that and you go, okay. The thing is, everybody thought this was Tua's to lose, but I mean, Tua, he really made his mark early in the season when he was throwing 30 of 32, for like 4 touchdowns and no interceptions. But I really don't think he had as difficult a schedule in a lot of ways, and he certainly, he's a talented guy, and I think some of the injuries down the stretch kind of hurt him as well in terms of keeping his numbers down, especially when you look at having to leave the SEC championship game. I believe he left a couple other games early with some knocks to his ankle. I believe it was. So anyway, Dwayne Haskins, sixth in the country in completion percentage. 70% of his passes were completed this year. That's ridiculous. Kyler Murray did finish second in that category, 70.9 to Dwayne's 70.2. So just a matter of tenths of a percentage point there. And again, Tua was 11th in that category. Yards, it's going to be Haskins, because Haskins led the country in yards, 4,580. You got to go down to third for Kyler, and Tua is way down at 14th in yards. And then, of course, touchdowns. Dwayne Haskins led the country in touchdowns with 47. Kyler was second with 40. And Tua was tied for third with Will Grier with 37. Haskins had one more interception than Kyler Murray. Tua only threw 4 interceptions all year, so he won that category pretty easily. But this is the kind of year where you think why not just share the Heisman Trophy? These three quarterbacks are all phenomenal.
They are. And I'm glad that you rattled off all the stats, because I think the average person, without looking at the stats, would have just presumed that Kyler Murray was the statistical leader in all of those different things for yardage and touchdowns, and the way that the media was blowing up Tua's performance. And I'm not taking anything away from either Tua or Kyler. I think Dwayne Haskins, as I said when you asked me the question originally, I think Dwayne Haskins' performance down the stretch, when Ohio State really, when we talk about the idea of November as being for contenders, that's when Dwayne Haskins his performance really started to kind of get back to his early, the first few games caliber performance, where, he was throwing for big yards and multiple touchdowns. And as you said, he threw one more interception, but I mean, the yards, the touchdowns, everything, and the fact that his running has improved, I think has truly made him, if not the Heisman Trophy winner, certainly worthwhile that he won the silver football for the Big Ten this past season.
Yeah. Now, you will say, obviously, Kyler and Tua are more accomplished runners as well than Dwayne Haskins. So there's that to factor in. But, it's you look across the country, and people in the Pacific Northwest think that Gardner Minshew should win the Heisman Trophy. You got people that think Will Grier should be in the conversation. But it just goes to show you how good Dwayne Haskins was this year, that in most of those categories, he is as good or better than some of his competition. And there's not really a wrong answer. It's just a shame that one person has to win it, and in a year when it's this close. Because there's usually one guy who's just ridiculous, and then there's a couple other guys who are really, really good. But long before anybody ever gets on a plane to New York, who's going to win it. This year, a little bit more mystery.
Yeah, and let's face it, the Heisman Trophy, the way that the presentation is drawn out for an hour unnecessarily.
Yeah.
It's the kind of thing where you're sitting there, just please, let's get this over with. And I think the fact that, as you said, that Tua, Kyler, Dwayne, I think they're all worthwhile recipients, and it remains to be seen on Saturday night who's going to win it. My personal prediction is it's going to be Kyler Murray, but it would be very satisfying if Dwayne Haskins emerged as the Heisman Trophy winner come Saturday night.
It would. It would be tremendous for that young man. And because then if he doesn't come back, he got his Heisman anyway.
Sure.
He's a redshirt sophomore?
Yes, redshirt sophomore.
So, there's always that sort of tiebreaker in the voters' minds of, he's a sophomore, he'll come back, and that's not always the case anymore these days. So, I personally believe that cost Keith Byers a shot at the Heisman his junior year, that he was a junior and was coming back the next year. But that's a discussion for another day. So Dwayne has already kind of said that he's looking forward to playing in the Rose Bowl. Draymond Jones, not so much. He said, we'll see. What do you think of the seniors and the guys who may leave early? How many guys do you think might skip this bowl game?
That's a very good question. So Draymond Jones, more than likely going to the NFL, because based on I'm guessing that he has not received his NFL draft evaluation yet, but he had contemplated it last year. So the fact that he's not entirely sure about playing in the bowl game, I can't really blame him. So let's kind of put him to the side for the moment. Mm-hmm. As far as other players contemplating leaving, out of the juniors and redshirt sophomores who are eligible to leave, we've been talking about Dwayne Haskins, and I fully anticipate Dwayne Haskins going to the NFL, but I can understand why he would play in the game, because as a quarterback, the possibility of injury is not nearly as significant as it is for a lineman like Draymond Jones. So I'm not surprised that Dwayne Haskins says he is going to play. as far as other people possibly declaring early, I mean, we talked about KJ Hill, and I think that's more of a reflection of the fact that I think it might be because, let's face it, if Dwayne Haskins is gone and all of the receivers that he has grown accustomed to playing with Paris Campbell, Johnny Dixon, and Terry McLaurin gone, that makes sense. So I would say I'd throw KJ Hill in there. I don't see Jordan Fuller going. He could, but I would be surprised if he did. So I'm going to say right now that I think those three players, KJ Hill, Draymond Jones, Nick Bosa is already declared. So right. So there's another one. So you've got those four. We already know Nick Bosa is not going to play. I'm going to say that Draymond Jones isn't going to play.
Yeah. The guy says we'll see. I mean, if you're already saying we'll see the night of the Big Ten championship game, I mean that speaks volumes to me. What about seniors though? They're not. They could always opt out. They could always say, you know what, I think I'm done. Especially a guy like Johnny Dixon, who's had a lot of injury problems in his career, or a guy like Paris Campbell, who's a speed guy. You never want to see him, maybe have something happen to a knee or whatever. I don't want anybody to skip the bowl game, especially if it's their last game with their brothers. I always think that, what would I do? I've never been in a position where I've had to make a few $1 million decision like that. And how difficult that must be for a kid, especially a kid who loves his teammates. Do I go out there one more time and just say what the hell and just assume everything's going to be fine and maybe it's not, or do I make that business decision and say, as much as I'd like to be out there with you guys, I've got to take care of this because you're only going to get your first contract once.
Yeah, you're raising really interesting points. Like, out of that wide receiver group, and this is not meant to disparage any of them, I would think Paris Campbell would be the highest rated simply because of what we talked about earlier in terms of his big play potential. Mm-hmm. That's not to minimize Johnny Dixon and Terry McLaurin because I think that they're both really good wide receivers. And my admiration for KJ Hill is off the charts because I think his dependability as a solid possession receiver is so underrated. I think so many people, to kind of paraphrase Bull Durham, chicks dig the long ball kind of, it's like, I understand that, but, give me the guy that is willing to go over the middle, make the tough catches, keep the drives going, on third and whatever, and come up with clutch receptions. That's what KJ Hill is. But I'm not sure what the draft grades are going to be for those other wide receivers. I think all of them will warrant getting picked. I certainly see out of that group for sure, Paris Campbell would be the highest of the group. Mm-hmm. And then KJ Hill would be the second, simply because of kind of what we were just talking about. I just don't know what the drafts like. I would see the concerns about injury, but I would also, based on that draft evaluation, and if you're told going into and now in these guys' case being seniors, I'm not sure what kind of draft evaluations they get. I know that underclassmen can request it, mm-hmm. But I would just, depending on what you're told, may impact the decision overall. That's just, like I said, I'm not really giving you a definitive answer because I just don't know what kind of draft grade Johnny Dixon or Terry McLaurin are going to get. I think they're both going to get opportunities to play, but it might not be as far as like a draft. I would have to say that, in all fairness to both of them, I would say both of them would be more like day 3 picks, late. When you think about, let's face it, like Noah Brown a couple years ago. Remember mm-hmm. when Noah Brown declared, and that was a surprise, and then he was barely picked at all by the Dallas Cowboys in the 7th round. And at the time, everyone thought, man, what a horrible decision. And then when you think about other players that have flashed big play potential, like Jalen Marshall, he didn't get picked, and now he's already out of the league. So yeah. It's a tough decision. I don't envy anyone who has to make it, because on one hand, you don't want to sustain any kind of career-threatening injury, but by the same token, these are opportunities for you to showcase your ability on the biggest scale against some top-notch competition. And the University of Washington, I know we'll get into greater detail about them as it gets closer to the bowl game, their secondary is tremendous. So a big game against Washington in the granddaddy of them all, as they say, might be something that could elevate somebody's draft stock.
Yeah. I just see KJ Hill averaging 10 catches a game for the New England Patriots next year.
Oh, sure. Why not? Why not?
I mean, he's the kind of guy that Bill Belichick would take and just absolutely destroy teams with by throwing him these little 10 to 12 yard routes over and over and over all day long. So, but yeah, it'll be interesting to see how that goes, and also be interesting to see what the evaluators are telling Dwayne Haskins, because if they're telling him, you might be the sixth quarterback taken, but if you stay in school, you might be the first quarterback taken. That might make a huge difference too. So, I mean, as we all think that certainly Dwayne Haskins will be an early round pick, but there's still that opportunity to move up to the elite, the very top of the charts. And some guys will risk that and stay in school another year to try to do that. So it'll be interesting to see how that goes.
I certainly believe Dwayne Haskins is going to leave, simply because we mentioned Tua Tagovailoa. Tua is a true sophomore, meaning that after next season, Tua will probably declare for the NFL draft himself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Based on everything that I have read, that Dwayne Haskins, if the draft were to end, if the season were to end, Dwayne Haskins would be a first round draft choice. The issue for Dwayne Haskins is, unlike most years, there aren't a lot of quarterback needy teams up at the top of the draft. Like, for example, like the 49ers I believe they have the top pick in the draft if the season were to end today.
Yeah, they were projected to take Nick Bosa as early as today, or as late as today, most recent as today.
Right. So they've got Jimmy Garoppolo under contract. So that might be the kind of thing where he's not going to necessarily go number 1 or number 2, but he might go in that top 10 based on, the other players, because we still don't know, for example, all the players they have until after the bowl games in January to declare. And I just think Dwayne Haskins, everything that we've been raving about fairly about his performance throughout the season, the yards, the touchdowns, the accuracy, all these things, his size, all these things. And then, okay, let's go to Indianapolis in a controlled environment and having him throw in T-shirt and shorts and have him put on a show. And I could see him going up to the board and drawing plays and knocking the socks off of NFL coaches and executives. And all of a sudden, all right, well, he's he's got everything we're looking for. He just is lacking the experience. I could see Dwayne Haskins certainly being a top 10 pick, and I would be more surprised if Dwayne Haskins comes back than if he goes for the NFL.
Sure. I don't disagree with you. I just throwing that out there because, we got to talk about it. We got to look at it from all angles.
Oh, sure.
All right. So Ohio State headed to the Rose Bowl to play Washington. The Huskies will, of course, get into that as we get closer to the end of December. But, the other teams that the other dominoes that Ohio State would have liked to have fallen did not fall. In some cases, they didn't even come close. Pittsmas was canceled as Pitt got rolled by Clemson, proving once and for all that the ACC was a one-team league in 2018. And, congratulations to Clemson for being in the correct league and and for going undefeated and getting into the college football playoff. They were pretty much in, and it seemed like people were saying they'd be in even if somehow Pitt managed to beat them. Alabama got in by winning the SEC and going undefeated. Apparently, enough people were really impressed by Georgia's ability to lose a close game to Alabama and have two losses, because Georgia ends up fifth in the college football playoff committee poll. We'll talk about that in a moment. I think that I wouldn't have voted for a team to be fifth if their coach was dumb enough to try a fake punt from midfield in a tie game with the base Alabama defense on the field on 4th and 11. But that's just me.
Yeah, I mean, the frustrating part for me is because I look at it going into Saturday night, even with Ohio State the favorite, it seemed as though that the cake was baked before kickoff for Ohio State with their playoff chances, and that's just the nature of it. I still believe that what it comes down to in the eyes of the playoff committee, they didn't come out and say it this way, but they should have just said, we never forgave Ohio State for that 29-point loss at Purdue. We just never did, and we never would, and that's end of story. But to push this narrative that because Georgia lost a close game, how that meant more, I don't understand how losing ever means more than winning the game. And the person that I'm just kind of incredulous at is not, it's not the Paul Feinbaums of the world, because that's his job to stir the pot on behalf of the SEC. The person I'm most incredulous at is Kirk Herbstreit. And I realize that he has done everything he could to try to build up his reputation as being unbiased. I'm sure it's very difficult being a former Ohio State quarterback, dealing with the expectation of the national college football fandom that he is going to be a proponent of Ohio State. But for Kirk Herbstreit to be the one leading the parade on national television, talking about how Georgia should be that fourth team, and for everyone to be conveniently excusing and completely ignoring the fact that, yes, Georgia lost a close game. But guess what? They got beat by 20 points by a mediocre LSU team that Alabama blanked late in the season. So why that was excused and completely overlooked, like I said, I mean, I have given up on the mere thought of the college football committee having any kind of consistency, because when they talk a few years ago about the idea that, okay, well, the winning your conference matters, which is why in 2015, when Ohio State was largely considered one of the best teams in the country, but they were excluded because they lost to Michigan State late in the season, didn't win the Big Ten. But now you're saying that Georgia, which didn't win the SEC, is one of the best teams, which means they should be considered. I mean, the inconsistencies are just too rampant to discuss. I've long been a proponent of an extended playoff, even before the book Death to the BCS came out by Dan Wetzel years ago. I've always been of the opinion, I can't speak about how things are done down in Florida for Ohio, or for high school football. I know in Ohio, it's all based on strength of schedule and computer rankings. There's no voting. It's all based on, I mean, you can go, there are teams that have winning records, but if they don't have the right strength of schedule, they're excluded from the playoffs. And then there are teams that have a few losses, like up to 3, but if they're playing a very difficult schedule, they can make the playoffs. So my point is, I just think it would be wonderful if we went to 8, like most people are suggesting, the idea that the group of the Power 5 conferences, you win your conference, you're in, having maybe a berth for the group of 5, however that would be determined, I'm certainly open to, and having at-large berths. And then the first round of the playoffs being on campus is something that I believe is what this sport tremendously needs. I've seen sure you have too, the different tweets where they're talking about if the first round of the playoffs was this weekend, Ohio State would be at Notre Dame in South Bend.
Absolutely, yeah, that's absolutely would be phenomenal to have those first round games at the very least on campus. You finish higher, you win the higher seed. Your reward is you get a home game in the playoff, and most of these stadiums, or at least many of them, are bigger than the NFL counterparts where they have these neutral site games.
Yeah, I mean, that's all I'm saying is I've never liked, for all of my love of college football, I have never liked the idea of voting on who before the BCS. I didn't like the idea of voting on it. I certainly didn't like the idea that when there were multiple teams that were worthy, that it was excluded down to 2. And I certainly don't like the idea that when there were multiple teams that were worthy of playoff consideration, and we haven't even talked about UCF.
Mm-hmm.
Poor UCF. I mean that with all sincerity. That
I know
for 2 years they have done everything that was asked of them. They've won every game, and they do not come within a sniff of playoff consideration or a shot at the national title. So you tell me about the fairness of the system.
I think UCF should definitely have been able to join the Big 12 because they have a Big 12 offense and a Big 12 defense.
Well, the Big 12 would be the Big 12 would be well suited to Adam, because this idea. I mean, I respect Bill Bender of the Sporting News. Obviously, I have tremendous respect for Tony Gerdeman because we write with him and for the Ozone. But just this idea that, all right, well, the inconsistency that the Big Ten is being hurt by their, I'm not going to call it moral, but their stance on, all right, well, we're going to play 9 conference games. Well, look at the SEC and the ACC play 8, and then they play an FCS opponent. So I just think if I had the power as the college football czar, I would make it a uniform approach where every team would play the same number of conference games. And if you play an FCS opponent, that would hurt you in the standings. You wouldn't be rewarded for it. You would be hurt for it.
Mm-hmm.
Because I just think that's the only way you're ever going to get any changes. Now, why should the SEC or ACC ever change the way that they go about doing business when look at how rewarding it's been? I mean, every year the SEC and ACC have been in the playoffs since this began.
Absolutely. And you talked about the College Football Playoff Committee's moving goalposts in terms of Ohio State. It's been a moving goalpost, and Ohio State benefited the first time from that moving goalpost in the fact that the criteria used to be to reward teams for playing difficult schedules. Ohio State went out and scheduled Oklahoma, beat them, and that's what got them in the Final Four, and they win the championship. So, it moves. The goalposts move every year. It seems to be about Ohio State. I have a theory that I'm gonna bounce off you. I don't know that somebody's probably mentioned this, but I want to bring it up on our show because we haven't discussed it. But let me just finish the thoughts on the Final Four. Notre Dame gets in at the 3 slot. They of course didn't have to play a championship game. They're a fake ass ACC team in that they don't have to really be in the ACC, but they get to play a lot of the ACC's mediocre teams, and so they go undefeated. They beat Michigan. Okay, 7-point win at home against Michigan. They beat Ball State. They beat Vanderbilt, Wake Forest, Stanford in kind of a down year. Virginia Tech in a very down year. Virginia Tech had to reschedule a game just to get bowl eligible on the last day of the season. They barely beat Pitt at home. They beat Navy. Navy was, again, not the best year for Navy. They beat Northwestern by 10. So if you look at the common opponents between Ohio State and Notre Dame, Michigan and Northwestern, Ohio State beat both of those teams by a wider margin. Then they really just crushed a bad Florida State team. Syracuse they beat. Syracuse has been okay. They've been good sometimes and really bad others. And then they finished the year at USC. Again, another down year for USC, and they win by a touchdown there. So it would have been a bad precedent to leave an undefeated Notre Dame team out but that's not an impressive resume in terms of who they beat this year. And again, you could probably say that Ohio State's resume wasn't that impressive in some respects, but obviously the big difference there was the common opponent with Michigan and the common opponent with Northwestern. Then Oklahoma, of course, gets in, avenging a loss to Texas. This is a new criteria of Chip that we've never heard before, is that Oklahoma was able to, they lost to a ranked team, but they were able to avenge that loss. Well, I would have liked to have played Purdue again, but they didn't make it to Indy. So, Ohio State didn't get that same opportunity that Oklahoma had. And, Ohio State and Oklahoma, when you measure them by any reasonable metric, Ohio State should have had the advantage. The only thing, and this is something that Joel Klatt's been beating, God bless him, is the committee made this about a loss. They didn't make it about the wins. They made it about the loss. And that's the wrong message to send. This should be about winning games. It shouldn't be that, okay, both teams lost a game, but this team lost by a few more points to, an inferior opponent. I'm sorry, did Texas play an emotional night game for a kid with cancer? I don't think that the emotional level was the same for that game, even though it's a rivalry game. They actually said that they lost on a neutral field, as if that was an advantage for Oklahoma when Ohio State lost a true road game, which is obviously much more difficult to win than a neutral site game. And to me, I don't really care so much about the margin of victory, because Ohio State was trying to do some things late in that game to get back in it, and those garbage time touchdowns, yes, they cosmetically made the score more lopsided, but the game was not. I mean, it wouldn't have gotten any better. I mean, Ohio State was trying to win the game. If they had stayed in their base and been more conservative, they could have stopped the bleeding. But they were trying to win the game. They weren't trying to lose by less, and that's what happened. I mean, Dwayne Haskins tries to make a play, gives up an interception for a touchdown. I mean, he's not trying to make that play if he's not trying to win the game. So should Ohio State not try to win that game and just keep it as a 10-point loss? Is that the message here?
I guess so. I mean, it remains to be seen. Seriously, I we'll never know. As you said, I like the way that you phrase it, because it's accurate. The continually moving goalposts. We never know what the criteria is. I was led to believe when the college football playoff began that conference championships were a prime consideration. Now, Fortunately for this year's iteration, Oklahoma, they are the conference champion for the Big 12. Now, yes. The fact that they had an opportunity to avenge their loss, I'm going to say that it was kind of dubious, but Notre Dame, they are the lucky recipients of not having to play that extra game. They were able to sit at home and kind of confidently believe that they had done everything that they needed to do to get in. Clemson, it was no big surprise to me that they were going to swamp Pitt, which they did, and Alabama, Georgia was close. Like I said, I don't have an issue with the fact that Oklahoma got in, as much as I'm more irked at the fact that even in their loss, that Georgia was rewarded over Ohio State. So as you also said, which I agree with, this should not be about one singular bad loss. If anything, why Georgia is not considered to have suffered a bad loss when LSU faded down the stretch.
Yeah, I mean, and I hadn't gotten to 5 yet, but it's I'm not taking anything away from Oklahoma. I don't have a problem with Oklahoma getting in if that's what they think, but every criteria they've given for the reason for choosing Oklahoma doesn't hold water. Oh, we were worried about Ohio State's defense. Have you watched Oklahoma play defense? And yeah, they played a little bit better against Texas, but I mean, Ohio State got Tim Becked again. I mean, because the play calling for Texas in that game was atrocious. I watched every bit of that game, and I was disgusted because everything Texas was doing that was working, they stopped doing it, and it was just like they would get something going, and then Tim Beck would throw in this weird, funky trick play that had no chance. And it was like, what are you doing? You're still screwing us over, Tim Beck. As for the decision to put Georgia at 5 is indefensible. I mean, for the reasons that you've already outlined. Kirk Herbstreit has become Gary Danielson 2.0, so I'm not too worried about what he says anymore. He's so enamored of the SEC, just like Gary Danielson, that there's just they can't do any wrong in his eyes. I mean, that 20-point loss that Georgia had to a mediocre LSU team just happened to be that LSU was led by a guy who did not win the Ohio State quarterbacking position and then had to transfer. So, I mean, I love Joe, but I mean, come on, he came out second best and went and beat Georgia this year by 20.
Yeah, I have said before about Joe Burrow, and I'm not backing down from what I said. I really thought he was going to win because of the mobility factor. It had nothing to do with Joe Burrow. I thought his arm, as evidenced by the season Dwayne Haskins had. I thought. Joe Burrow is, and I still believe it to this day, I think is a very good quarterback. I think Dwayne Haskins athletically has a lot on Joe Burrow, with probably the exception of the mobility factor. But getting back to, I think Kirk Herbstreit, I may be mistaken, but I think one of the popular vacations for Ohio State fans in the offseason is the Buckeye Cruise for Cancer. And Kirk Herbstreit is usually a participant because it's a big fundraiser, and Urban Meyer and Shelley Meyer usually make an appearance, and a lot of former Ohio State players. And I seem to recall Kirk Herbstreit being among those players that has attended that. And they usually have a question and answer session with the fans that are on that ship. If Kirk Herbstreit goes, I think that will be quite interesting of a spectacle for him, because I'm sure there will be fans on the cruise ship that will demand why Kirk Herbstreit was such a vocal and adamant supporter of Georgia over Ohio State and Oklahoma on college football playoff selection Sunday.
Yeah. I did see a little Twitter battle between, I don't know if you saw this, between Dontre Wilson and Joey Galloway, where Dontre called Joey out for not repping the Buckeyes, and Joey defended himself saying, I thought Oklahoma and Notre Dame should be in, and that's, my opinion, and I wouldn't be doing my job if I was, just, out there stumping for Ohio State. So it kind of went back and forth a little bit, but at the end of the day, again, I think it's a great season, especially if Ohio State goes out and wins the Rose Bowl. You can't really say a Rose Bowl championship at the end of the year is a bad season. I know there are people that will disagree with me, and I will say that you're entitled to your incorrect opinion. But, it's nobody is guaranteed a Final Four. So it's just like saying that, your favorite college basketball team, it's a disaster of a season if they don't make the Final Four. It's just too hard to do it, to count on that. There are different measurements of success. National championships are not guaranteed. Shots at national championships are not guaranteed. So go out and the bottom line is you go out, you have your season, you play it, and try to enjoy it. Don't be miserable and counting points and counting style points, which is my least favorite phrase in all of sports. But just try to enjoy what your team's doing, because you get a finite number of college football seasons when you're on this planet. So you may as well enjoy them and look at the positive side of it. And 12-1, beat Michigan again, scored 60 on them, won the Big Ten, now a chance to be Rose Bowl champions. That's and finish 13-1. That's a pretty special season. And when you look at Dwayne Haskins and what he did this year, and the fact that he probably won't be back next year, I certainly hope you enjoyed this season.
I certainly have. And
I'm not talking to you. I'm talking about basically all of our listeners.
Yeah,
I know you enjoyed it.
I enjoy every moment of it. I never thought about it until when you were talking about the Rose Bowl. It never dawned on me that, and I know that Tom Orr has written a lot of great articles for the Ozone about the Rose Bowl, how it, the idea that it was always growing up in Ohio and growing up Big Ten fans before any idea of any kind of playoff system, the Rose Bowl was always the pinnacle for any Ohio State fan.
Mm-hmm.
And what just kind of came to mind is, as I was thinking about it, the last time Ohio State played in the Rose Bowl against Oregon was 9 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't dawn on me until just now. Literally, it was 9 years ago. How fast it seems. I can still picture Terrell Pryor throwing that desperation pass up that Jake Ballard went up into the sky and came down with to keep a drive going, and Ohio State defeating Oregon when a lot of people thought Oregon was going to run them off the field with this dazzling Chip Kelly offense and Jeremiah Masoli.
Yep.
So you see what I'm saying? Like it's that crystal clear to me, but the fact that it was 9 years ago, that my point being that how, so many things have obviously changed from 9 years ago to today, but that Rose Bowl game it's one of those Ohio State classic games that the Big Ten Network often likes to show.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm certainly looking forward to bringing in the new year with a game on, a game at 5:00 against a quality opponent in Washington. And I certainly hope that other Ohio State fans are looking forward to beginning the new year in the granddaddy of them all.
Yeah, and go back and watch that Oregon Ohio State game and watch Terrell Pryor throw that touchdown pass to DeVere Posey and tell me that guy can't throw a touchdown. Tell me he can't tell me he can't throw a football. Go watch that play. So the last thing I want to get into, Chip, and maybe this is a sticky subject, but I'm going to put it out there because it's something I've been thinking about since Northwestern won last week and dropped 2 places in the poll, in the college football playoff poll, sitting their starters for a good chunk of that game against a bad Illinois team that they knew they could just show up and beat, which they did by multiple scores. And again, they used a lot of backups. They were very vanilla. They had, Pat Fitzgerald said it. We didn't show anything the last 2 weeks because we were getting ready for Ohio State. We'd already clinched. So it struck me last week as an odd thing that the committee moved Northwestern back after a victory like that. And it certainly looked like they were positioning the SEC teams to maximize the help that Alabama and Georgia would get if they lost. But before anybody cries, accuses me of crying conspiracy here, Joel Klatt's done enough of that, by the way. Joel Klatt has pointed out the fact that when you take out the guys that recused themselves, the members of the committee that had to recuse themselves, it was a very southeast-centric 10 voters remaining. So if you take that into account, it's not a surprise that Georgia finished 5th and Ohio State 6th. But getting back to my point, I think that you and we can go back to one of our first podcasts together, one of our first Silver Bullets podcasts together, when we discussed Urban Meyer's preseason suspension. And I honestly believe that there is an element, I don't know how widespread this element is, but I think it's out there, that there was going to be no room for any error on Ohio State's part this year, because the fact that a lot of people thought that Urban Meyer got away with something despite all of the evidence to the contrary, despite the fact that Zach Smith's charges were dropped, despite the fact that the committee said that he reported appropriately everything he was supposed to report, although sometimes the exact manner that those reports were done weren't exactly line for line with the procedure. Everything was they found no wrongdoing on that account, but there is still a very large segment of the population that thinks that he's dirty, that he did something wrong, that he's crooked, that he covered for domestic violence, that all of the things that Brett McMurphy wrote about, I think damaged Urban Meyer, and I think damaged this program. And it doesn't matter what, if Courtney Smith came out and said, you know what, I made the whole thing up, I think people would still think that Urban Meyer got away with something. And that is, I think, was in the back of some of those voters' minds all along. And I think that for that reason, Ohio State really couldn't put a foot wrong this year. What do you think about that?
I think you're raising a lot of interesting points, and it's not necessarily all of the tinfoil hat variety. That Urban Meyer, even before this season, Urban Meyer was never going to be at the top of everyone's most loved coaches list, fairly or unfairly. He has gained a lot of people, a lot of critics within the media. He is certainly his reputation for that has followed him from Florida for, let's just say, he left Florida a broken program, and look at the mess that Will Muschamp was left with, and all these things that that you've heard for years and years and years.
Mm-hmm.
That I think, as you said, that as soon as these allegations by Brett McMurphy of Urban Meyer participating in a cover-up, I think that maybe that it didn't play a tremendous factor within the committee. I'm sure there are people within that committee, though, that there is no love lost for Urban Meyer.
Mm-hmm.
And as you said that, all right, you throw in a 29-point loss, which I still, I'll when I remember the 2018 season years from now, it will always, to me, the exclusion of the playoffs is always that's going to be first and foremost on my mind, is that you can't lose like that to a 6-6 team on the road on national television. That'll be always first and foremost. But then, all right, let's just throw in the fact that, something, they've looked inconsistent most of the year. They haven't really been world beaters against, the teams that you would think Ohio State would be much more impressive against. They weren't. And, oh, by the way, the coach didn't really put his best public relations face or foot forward the way that he handled it. So, those are all contributing factors, as you said.
Yeah, and again, I'm not saying that it may not even have been a conscious thing. It just may be, it may be a bias. We're all human beings. We all have biases, whether we're aware of them or not, and that may have been a contributing factor. But it certainly looked to me like, there was really no. I mean, even with the big win over Michigan, I still heard people go, "Well, they still gave up 39 points." I mean, come on. I mean, 7 of it was garbage time. Anybody that watched the game saw, okay, the unbelievable plays that Nico Collins had to make to get in the end zone. They saw some of the questionable penalties that maybe kept the score from getting a little more out of hand. So even with the incredible, ratings that game got, and how many people watched it, you still heard some of those rumblings. So it was like, oh, they still gave up 39 points, but you never heard that about Oklahoma. Well, they still gave up, 59 points, or whatever, 52 points. The fact of the matter is, Oklahoma got exceedingly lucky that Oklahoma State's quarterback couldn't manage that 2-point conversion, because that play was there to be made, and that really ultimately could have been the death sentence for Oklahoma. But at the end of the day, Ohio State had a great season. I still think it was a great season. It would have been nice to have seen what Ohio State could do against some of those other teams. I think that certainly they would have been high-scoring games. Ohio State's defense is flawed, but Ohio State's offense is so good that, everybody talks about, the committee talks about Oklahoma's historically good offense. Ohio State was right there with them all year. So, just because Oklahoma has a good offense, that's not an argument against Ohio State. Ohio State also has a good offense. Ohio State won a lot of close games. Okay, Oklahoma won a lot of close games too. I'm not mad that Oklahoma's in, because they were a conference champion with only one loss, and it was to a ranked team. I'm not mad that they're in. I don't think any of the arguments that we've been given make any sense. That they basically could have flipped a coin.
Yeah, absolutely. And if anything, if you're an Ohio State fan, or if you're a Georgia fan, because Georgia gets to take on Texas in the Sugar Bowl in the game that's going to follow the Rose Bowl on New Year's. I'm just going to say New Year's night. This is an opportunity for you to, if Alabama puts a whooping on Oklahoma, like the odds makers certainly have it currently, and if Clemson does the same thing to Notre Dame as the odds makers have it currently, then that's when you have the opportunity to prove all of the naysayers wrong, that the committee got this wrong. Mm-hmm. As you said, there are inherent biases against Ohio State, fairly or unfairly. This is an opportunity for Ohio State, for the players and coaches to go out and show the rest of the college football world that they were deserving of that fourth playoff spot.
Yeah, and that's really how they have to approach it. They have to go out there saying, with that chip on their shoulder. I think that's one of the best things that Urban Meyer has going for him, is that he's never coached in the Rose Bowl before, and he can talk to his team for close to a month about how disrespected they are and how nobody wants to see them succeed, and it's Ohio against the world. And I think that's all a lot of really good ammunition for him. He's a master motivator, and I think he'll use every bit of that. So anyway, we will see how it plays out. I personally think that Alabama has a good enough defense that Oklahoma will not shred them the way that they have shred some of the defenses that they've played this year. I do think Georgia will beat Texas, because I don't think Texas is a great football team. And I think Clemson will put it on Notre Dame. I think that Ohio State, if you would ask me, what do you think Ohio State would do in the college football playoffs? Well, I honestly don't. I don't think that they would beat Alabama. I don't know that they would beat Clemson, but I think that they would be in those games because of Dwayne Haskins.
Oh, certainly. And I think Dwayne Haskins, his performance over the last several weeks would certainly give any defensive coordinator pause. I don't care if it's Nick Saban or not. I think there's certainly, his performance has warranted his trip to New York City, and would certainly be giving Nick Saban a lot of concern going into December 29th.
Yeah, and I think Oklahoma has a good offense that will enable them to hang around for a while. But I think that you look at if I look at Ohio State and Oklahoma's defenses. I mean, Oklahoma's not even covering receivers half the time. Ohio State at least has a defensive back running next to the receiver. They just don't defend the ball. So
yeah.
That's the difference between the two.
Yeah, and that's got to get improved between now and the next game.
Absolutely. All right, Chip. That should just about do it for this edition of the Silver Bullets podcast. I didn't even look to see if we had any mail, because I knew this was going to be a long one, and we can address any mail in next week's show when we start maybe looking ahead to the Rose Bowl. But how can folks find you on the internet?
I can be found on Twitter at Chip Minnich. My last name is spelled Minnich. And like Michael, I'm a contributor to the Ozone.net on the Hayes and Cannon section, as well as a contributor to Athlon Sports.
All right. Yes. Find us on Hayes and Cannon at theozone.net. I am on Twitter at Mike36Fan. And we appreciate you listening. Please listen to all our sister shows on the Ozone Radio Network. You've got the Sloopcast, Buckeye Sloopcast on Mondays and Fridays. You've got us on Tuesday. You've got the Buckeye Weekly Podcast on Wednesday, and the Sons of Schmidt on Thursday. So a full lineup for you. And then there are also all kinds of game day treats from the Buckeye Weekly Podcast as well. So check it all out, and like us on on Facebook and all that stuff. So the Ozone is everywhere. We've got several accounts on Twitter you can follow. Hayes and Cannon has an account. Ozone Radio Network has an account. Silver Bullets Podcast has an account. What's that? That's SILVR?
I believe so, yes.
Yes. So Silver with no E, Bullet, and it's just Pod, right?
Yes.
Okay. So there you have it. And we will be back to talk a little bit about the Rose Bowl. And I'm sure there'll be news between now and then. Maybe some people declaring for the draft. This is the time of year when things are kind of busy, so we'll be back to do it all again next week, Chip.
Looking forward to it.
All right. So we'll wrap it up the way we always do by saying, Go Bucks!
Go Bucks!